Okay, so today we're going to be doing our lab on the force of friction. Specifically, in this lab, we are trying to determine the coefficient of friction between the bottom of these boxes that have the masses in them, so we've used these mass sets already, okay, between the bottom of these mass sets and the wooden tracks. Okay, now, you guys are part of an experiment. We have been trying to improve this lab for the last 4 years to make it better and more reliable and more consistent. Last year we started doing it with an incline, and it worked a little bit better. But we still had this problem with the coefficient of friction was still really, really low, and we couldn't make it consistent. Well, over the Easter break, Mr. Dickey found some anti-slip tape, which we have now applied to the bottom of all the mass boxes, which makes them very sticky. So there is a very high coefficient of friction present now, and this lab should work a lot better. You will be the first class to test this new method. Okay, so my manipulated variable is the presence of this tape. Comparing it to previous results, your manipulated variable will be something different because that's not what you're testing. Okay, so for the design for this lab, we are comparing two things. In this lab, we will be adding mass. Whoa, wait for it. We'll be adding mass to the box, okay? But we're not adding mass to add mass. We're adding mass to change part of this formula. When we add mass, what part of that formula do you suppose we change? The normal force. Okay, because in this lab, we're trying to compare the effect of normal force on the force of friction. In the process of doing that, we will determine the coefficient of friction between the bottom of the box and the ramp. Okay, but when it comes right down to it, we're going to change the normal force, and hopefully the force of friction will change in response to that. Okay. Now, there are some things that we're going to need to keep the same throughout this entire lab. Okay? Since we're going to be using an incline, one of the things involved in, making stuff move down an incline is going to have to stay the same. And I don't mean F parallel, so if you're thinking that, that's not it. Okay? Maybe the force that causes F parallel could be involved. Okay? So we need to make sure that that force stays the same, right? Also, we're always going to be using this and the bottom of the cart. Maybe that thing we're trying to determine throughout the lab would have to stay the same. Agreed? Okay, like the other part of that formula. I mean, if I'm trying to figure out what the effect of changing this right here, okay, is on this, I probably better make sure that doesn't change. Agreed? Okay, you can come up with one more. I gave you two. Okay, so those are your control variables. Remember, you're not just identifying, you're also explaining. And in that explanation, there needs to be a how you're controlling it and a why. Okay, also for the manipulated and responding. How are you manipulating it? How is it responding? Why? Okay, everybody with me there? So, for our hypothesis, okay, we want a hypothesis that talks about the relationship between the force of static friction and normal force, and how it can be used to determine the coefficient of friction. So the if part should talk about the relationship between normal force and the force of friction. The and part is, as always, going to briefly describe the experiment. And the then part how to calculate the coefficient of friction mu from a normal force versus force of friction graph. Okay, because we are going to plot, very simply, a graph of normal force versus the force of friction. Okay, so you are going to do, in this experiment, 6 trials, right? And those 6 trials are all going to involve a different normal force. A different normal force that is being provided by a different amount of mass inside the mass box. So your first trial is going to be just the box and the plastic tray inside. Okay, that will be your first trial. And that first trial, since you have a chart there that you might want to fill in, okay, that first trial's mass is 0.170 kilograms. That's the mass of the empty box with the tray. Okay. Okay, and all we're going to do for each trial is record the angle of the ramp when the box just begins to slide. Because remember, we're doing this for static friction. Okay? So just as the box begins to slide, that means that we just overcame the force of static friction, and now the thing is starting to slide, so now it's kinetic friction. Okay? So we'll be able to determine the force normal and the force of friction from the angle of the ramp. Okay? Using our inclined plane knowledge from before. Okay, so it's going to look something like this. Okay, so your first one here, I'm just going to dump them all up. Okay, so I just got the empty box, okay, and make sure the no-slip tape is centered on the wooden part. Don't have any of it overhanging. Okay, make sure it's centered as best you can on the wooden part of the ramp. Okay. Then you're going to take your phone and you're going to use your clinometer app that we used before to determine whether our track was level in the Newton lab. That's not the right app. That one is. Okay, so I put the level on there. Okay, so this is decently level. And then I'm just going to lift slowly. Okay, just started the slide, oh, and then I moved the thing. So you're going to need more than one person to do this. Someone's going to have to watch the phone. Like I had it pointing towards you so you could see it. Like I suppose one person could do it, get the phone facing you. Okay, you record that angle. All right. Now with that angle, you can determine the normal force, and it says in your lab how to do that. And you can determine the force parallel. In this case, the force parallel is equal to the force of friction. Okay, because we went to the point where it just started to move. That means that there was the same amount of force down as there was up. That's why it didn't move. Everybody with me there? All right, so you're going to do that, okay? And then on your next trial, you're going to put the first 5 masses in. Okay, so your next trial will be, what does it say there, 0.36, something like that? It's the first 5 masses in. Okay, so you put the first 5 masses in, do this again. Okay, then put one of the 200s in, do it again. Put another 200 in, do it again. Okay, put the 500 in, do it again. Put the 1 kilo in, do it again. Okay, then you'll have 6 trials. Okay, everybody with me there? Okay, let's get our data, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what we do with the analysis. Okay, so if every group can take a box of masses and a ramp, I call this one because I need to get new data. Okay guys, so let's talk about the data here now. So you've got the first chart filled in, where you've got your different masses and their corresponding angle. Okay, now you're going to need to follow the instructions here in the procedure, I think. Yeah, okay, in steps 5 and 6, where it's asking you to calculate your normal force and your F parallel, and telling you that your F parallel will be your maximum force of static friction for that particular trial. Okay, so as a quick reminder, when we are doing that, okay, we are essentially doing an inclined plane problem. Okay, so we have our inclined plane. Theta is always changing in this lab because it's, well, what we're using to calculate our responding variable. So in and of itself, it's kind of a responding variable too. Okay, but we've got this. We've got our force of gravity, we've got our normal force, and we've got our F parallel. Okay, we'll have our measured angle for each trial. So we'll use our mass to get our force of gravity. So whatever the mass is times 9.81 gets us that. Okay, then we've got the hypotenuse and the angle, so we can calculate our normal force and our parallel force. And you're going to want to put those into a Google Sheet. Okay, not that Google Sheet. This one, okay, where you're going to have normal force in the first column and the force of friction in the second column, so that you can graph them. Okay, you're going to make a scatter plot, put a best fit line on there, okay, put the equation for the line on, all that good stuff. Okay, so that's what you're doing with your data. Questions on what we're doing so far? Okay, I'm going to give you guys a chance to get that part done, and then we'll actually talk about the analysis part. Okay, so right now, get your data all filled in. Okay, so you're going to build a Google Sheet that's going to have normal force in newtons in the first column, okay, which we talked about. That you calculate that by finding the force of gravity and then going cos of the angle times the force of gravity. That'll get you that number. And then you calculate the force of friction in newtons, which will be column B, okay, by calculating Fg times the sine of the angle that you get. Okay, and that will give you your force parallel, which, as we said, is equal to the force of static friction at the point where the thing just begins to slide. Okay, so you'll have a Google Sheet that hopefully looks something like this. Your numbers might be slightly different, but they should be fairly close, as we all use pretty much the same setup. Okay, once you've got the data in, then highlight it and build a graph. Okay, as we always do, and make sure you got normal force. If we set it up this way, normal force should end up on the x-axis, and force of friction should end up on the y-axis. Okay, and then plot your best fit line. Okay, and this looks really linear. Okay, I know that probably your angles didn't look that way, and that's actually what threw us, both me and Mr. Dickey, the first time we tried this lab with angles, because we just weren't thinking. And we just kept lifting this thing up. Why isn't the angle getting bigger with more force? Why isn't the angle getting bigger with more force? And we're like, because we're stupid and it doesn't work that way. Okay? It's not just about the angle, it's about how much more mass I put in there, how much more normal force I'm getting as a result of that. Okay? So it's okay if your angles kind of go all over the place. We did this lab in this room probably 6 or 7 times before we finally face palmed and went, oh God, that data is just fine. Okay, once we started plugging it in. Okay. And so you should get something that looks like this, okay? And then have your equation there. Some part of that equation is going to represent your coefficient of friction. Okay. So that is what we are looking for you to do. Okay. So the remainder of this lab here, okay, is just filling in that chart, getting your graph in there, okay, and then justify and explain your calculations. Okay, tell me, okay, where did you get the coefficient of friction from? How did you get it? Why are you sure that that represents your coefficient of friction? Now, I'm going to say this so that it's on record. Do not do 6 separate calculations of FF over Fn equals mu. I don't want that. Okay, that's not how we want to get this. We're building this graph for a reason. If I just wanted to calculate 6 times what FF over FN was, and then average the 6, I'd have just asked you to do that. Okay? I want the graph, I want you to get mu from the graph and tell me why that part of the graph represents mu. Okay, is everybody clear on that? If I now see 6 calculations of FF over FN, having said I don't want to see that, I will be very displeased. And your mark will, well, look accordingly. Yeah. Okay, so then you have your conclusion, copy paste your hypothesis, same as always. Okay, explain why you can accept or reject it. Did the relationship go as we said it would? And just looking at this and going, yeah, at least for my data it sure did. Every time normal force went up, the force of friction went up by pretty much a linear amount. Okay, my graph shows that. Okay, so that seems to fit. Okay, was I able to calculate mu? Well, that's up to you guys. If you were able to calculate mu, if you got a number there that represents it, it seems reasonable. Okay, and then, okay, for your evaluation, 2 sources of error and ways to fix it. Now, I'm going to help you out a little bit here. Some things that, could be important. Are these ramps like perfectly uniform all the way along?
No.
Okay. Did you use the same part every time? Did you make sure your sled was in the same part, or did you just go the next one after it slid and just use the next spot and use the next spot? Did you wipe off the bottom every time? Because as that goes along, does it sand the wood a little bit? Little things to think about for sources of error, okay, that you might not have thought about while you were doing all that. Okay. Yeah, little things to think about there for sources of error. Ways to fix them are also necessary. So 2 sources of error and ways that you could make them better the next time.
Only need 2?
Only need 2. Okay, and then for class discussion, we don't. You don't need to do that because we've already talked about this stuff. Because I already taught the friction lesson. Sometimes I do this lab before the friction lesson, but it just didn't work out that way this time. So we've already talked about that stuff. So yeah, I will. I think I put a due date in here already, right? It is due on April 24th. Okay, at 8:30, so that's next week. All right. Questions from you guys?
Can I go?
You can. Yes. Okay, you got the rest of the class period to work on it, so you should be able to get a pretty good dent, I would think, on the lab report. Also, reminder that your Newton assignments are due on Wednesday.